But I think we need to, sooner than later, move to a customs union single market position to cement the fact that we want those closer economic and, frankly, political ties in with Europe, because that is a huge part of how we start to rebuild that clout on the world stage.
Four days before I went to university, 9/11 happened. And so people of our age have never known anything other than the consequences of that day. 20 years later, we are still dealing with it, not just in Britain, but around the world. So we have Layla Moran, our Foreign Affairs spokesman, coming onto the show to talk to me and Tom and David about what is a foreign policy, what is a liberal foreign policy after 9/11. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, David. So Layla's about to come on. What are you guys expecting to hear from Layla? Do you have any? Are you excited about this? Obviously, we should just point out to everyone that happening right now is the government reshuffle. So we think Raab might go, but we don't know. But it'll be interesting to hear from Layla about what that experience has been like, especially with the events in Afghanistan. So, David, what are you expecting out of this interview?
I think what will be very interesting to hear from Layla is really what the fallout from Afghanistan and obviously the return of the Taliban will be from a liberal perspective. Obviously, we're in a position where we need to push for the people that we need to get out of that country are obviously safe and well, but also it would be interesting to hear from Layla some other aspects of things that are going on in the globe, especially with things like that have happened today with North Korea firing ballistic missiles, and obviously other parts of Africa experiencing some severe difficulties. And really, it's just a good time to understand and remind people what a liberal foreign policy looks like.
And Tom?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the same as David. I think we've got particularly the scenes that we saw in Afghanistan and the fallout, the continued fallout from that. I've just had an email from my own council talking about refugees that will be coming into Greater Manchester. So I'm really going to be interested not only on Layla's kind of own personal thoughts about what we've seen in Afghanistan, but also I think the legacy of the attacks in 9/11, the Afghanistan war, and how that has, some may say, may have hamstrung our kind of foreign policy initiatives since then. And I think that would be a really interesting piece of insight if we can get Layla to be talking about those stuff.
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Praetor Rains. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Praetor Rains have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Praetor Rains are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Praetor Rains website at praetorrains.co.uk/liberal-democrats. Layla, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it. Again, just to remind viewers, we're happening right in the middle of the government reshuffle, so we have no idea what's happening. I mean, we've just heard very quickly, we've just heard that Gavin Williamson's lost his position.
That's obviously right.
You shadowed him for some time. So, does this matter? Or do you just think the cabinet at the moment, is we just replacing one incompetent with another? I don't know how.
Well, it is, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I whooped for joy when Gavin Williamson, when I started calling for his resignation, I think within weeks of him being put into post. And I think by that point, he was the 5th education secretary that I'd followed and was by far the worst, which at the time, I honestly didn't think was possible. And it's true to say that, what comes next may well be worse than the last, because the incompetence of this government stems from the top. As we speak, we are awaiting the fate of Dominic Raab, my current opposite number. But yeah, let's see what happens. They deserve to go. The question's going to be who they're replaced with.
Yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't fill me with joy.
No, absolutely not.
Or confidence.
But the reason we've got you on, Layla, and the purpose of this episode is that it's been a very emotional week for a lot of people. It's been 20 years since the anniversary of 9/11, which kind of fundamentally changed world politics for basically all of our adult lives of the people on this call. So, I mean, what's your impression of the last week? I mean, obviously there's tremendous meltdown in Afghanistan as well that's happened.
Yeah.
What are your feelings over this last week been like?
Yeah, well, it's been really emotional. And I'm sure, like a lot of people, you remember where you were that day. Now, my birthday is September the 12th. And so on September 11th, I was 18, about to turn 19. It was my second year of uni at Imperial in London. And I was in a Curry's because my parents had given me, I think it was like 100 quid to go buy a little television. I was really excited. So I went and managed to catch, we were there. And I remember my boyfriend at the time said, "Oh my God, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center." I was like, "What?" And we were just convinced it was an accident. And then as we were in that Curry's, on 40 or 50 screens, we watched the second plane crash. And I remember buying the television straight away, taking it back to the high rise in Battersea where we were living at that time. And my mother was just beside herself because everyone was convinced that London would be the next target because it would be obvious, you know, New York, London, Paris, whatever, you know, like we'd be up there. Everyone was on high alert. And the next few days, we were basically instructed, don't leave the flat, don't go into the centre of London, don't go anywhere near the Houses of Parliament or Canary Wharf or anywhere like that that might be sort of iconic in some way, stay away. And the aftermath of that, I think, has, you know, still being felt. And it's interesting, you know, you point out Afghanistan, and of course the war on terror and the way that that then led to various interventions across the world has very much shaped the whole of my politics, you know, from the Iraq War, which for many people was the reason so many joined the party back then. It was certainly, when I was at uni, one of the really distinctive things that we'd done as a party that made me sit up and take notice and felt really proud to vote Lib Dem as a student. And foreign policy has very often defined our party's fortunes in lots of ways. I think Afghanistan is sort of the end of one particular stanza of the aftermath of 9/11, and I don't think it's over.
David, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I guess, Layla, from our perspective, you know, we are kind of obviously seeing what's going on in Afghanistan now, and we've sort of allowed it to fall straight back to probably where it was pre 9/11. It seems like the whole Western world is kind of retreating from its responsibilities for the areas that it was a part of and involved in. I guess really is what happens now from an aftermath perspective, and what really should be the roles and responsibilities of the UK in helping perhaps the people in Afghanistan, but also, you know, do you foresee a perhaps where we might have to go back into Afghanistan if things start to deteriorate further?
It's really, really difficult. I mean, first of all, I think the basic premise that staying in Afghanistan forever was something that we wanted to get out of. I think that argument was won a long time ago. The question wasn't if we and the Americans and everyone else was going to go, it was when and how. And the shambles that we've seen is because the when and how was never properly thought through. There's a catastrophic failure of intelligence. And I don't just mean the kind that MI5 and MI6 collate. Something went terribly wrong. And it squarely lies, in my view, with Boris Johnson. Because first of all, he will have understood the importance of Afghanistan on the world stage. And it's a really, really complex area. Lots and lots of different ethnicities, lots of vested interests. We must remember that, you know, we have important relationships that we could have levied much earlier, in particular with countries like Pakistan, to secure safe passages and to make sure that there was stability and to put pressure. You know, it's not just all carrots, there are occasional sticks. And we did not use that leverage in advance of what happened. And since then, we now find ourselves in a position, my office is supporting 400 Afghan nationals, many of whom are family members of people who live in my community. We've got a really vibrant Afghan community in and around Oxford. And one subset of them are the Hazara Afghans, who are an ethnic minority who are regularly persecuted. In fact, my neighbor is a Hazara. And so through the last few years, I've heard what it's been like for his brother on the ground. When the Taliban started to take over the cities, the peripheral cities, his brother went into hiding. And now we're trying to work out how to get him out. And the government has no answers. And to add insult to injury, and I am proud to support those Afghans, and I will continue to support them. And my office stands ready and is doing everything we can. But the Home Office sent us a letter yesterday, basically saying, stop writing us emails, we're not going to answer back. And I am so livid. It's disgraceful. You know, many of these people are people who've helped us do incredible work, educating women and girls, building infrastructure, building civil society there. And as a result of being outspoken about, you know, liberal values that we hold so dear, they are now at risk, and we are basically letting them go. And I think this is a microcosm of the modus operandi of this government, which is they have a great idea, they then execute it poorly, their incompetence leads to chaos, and then they walk away. And actually, I think that can characterize almost any crisis, not just in Afghanistan, but pretty much any crisis that this government comes up against in almost any brief.
Tom?
Yeah, I've read about this this letter that I think I picked up on a tweet from you about it, Layla. And my worry is how does this affect our country's standing on the national stage? Because I mean, this is probably, you know, I'm looking through the history with rose-tinted glasses, but I always thought that, you know, Britain's place in the world was this kind of a very kind of a moral compass type role, that we would be able to kind of have a bit of authority, particularly with a very strong diplomatic nation, where we would be called in and we'd be able to, you know, if you think about stuff that happened in Sierra Leone, Yugoslavia, all these places that, you know, we've shown real leadership to try and help communities and nations across the world. If we're doing these type of things now and our own MPs are being told, stop writing to us about refugees, surely that damages our credibility on the world stage.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this purported phrase that they keep using, so-called global Britain, it's smoke and mirrors. It's a lie, you know, let's call it what it is. It's a convenient lie that they tell themselves almost. And whilst on the one hand, they claim that post-Brexit, they're going to stridently go out into the world and they're going to lead in a new Brexit, post-Brexit world and global Britain and all this gumph that comes out of their mouth. If you actually look at any of the detail of what's happening, they are slowly but surely, sometimes fast actually, dismantling the way that we can operate on a world stage. And it started with aid cuts. And I know it's getting to the point now where there are so many Tory broken promises, it's hard to know which one to particularly talk about today. But it started there. And they said and said and said over and over again in questions that I asked and others, you know, will you commit to keeping 0.7%, a liberal Democrat enshrined law, by the way, in the coalition years, and we're really proud of it. It's Michael Moore, the Lib Dem MP, that brought that through as a private member's bill. And that was the first deep cut. And I mean that in terms of our reputation, because first of all, we had promised that money. And whatever was happening domestically, internationally, the UK had power insofar as, you know, a British diplomat's word is their bond. You could trust the British government. When they said they were going to deliver, they would deliver. And that was the first time that I think a lot of people around the world looked at us and went, yee. And you add to that, you know, Brexit, and in particular the shenanigans over the Northern Ireland Protocol, our inability to donate enough vaccination doses to lower income countries. Just 2% of people in lower income countries have had one dose. It's extraordinary how little we've done, given that we've secured 442 million doses. We do have enough to be able to do what we need to do here and that. And we've got COP. So very many of these countries that we need to get on board to make COP26 a success and tackle the biggest, you think the pandemic's hard, try the climate emergency. And they are the same countries that have been let down through the aid cuts and through the inability for them to engage with vaccination and everything else. We are absolutely diminished. I don't know if there is a way back from here. And as all of us knows, it takes a lifetime to build up a good reputation. It takes a moment to lose it. And we've started from zero. But I'm not sure we're done going down yet. That's my worry. And that's what we need to keep an eye on.
That was kind of the premise of this episode, is kind of how do we turn this around? You know, that's because we believe in a more international society.
Yeah.
We want greater cooperation. So an obvious one will be, how quickly do we get links back in with Europe? Because America seems to be on a pathway it wants to be on its own. You know, that isolationism that Joe Biden has picked up a little bit of Donald Trump's mantle and ran with it. So if we're moved away from Europe, we've moved away from America, where else do we go? How do we get a more international British society?
Yeah. Well, just quickly on America, those two things are not linked, because the reason why America is having a much more hands-off approach with us is because we're just less valuable to them. We were so much more valuable to America when we were essentially America's ear into the economic might that is the European Union. And the reason why we were advocates for Remain, and we've gone through this so many times, but it was that argument that trade promotes peace. And we have now turned our back on that particular project. And as a result, we just don't have the same level of clout. So we need to find ways to make it up. And I think it starts, as you say, by rebuilding some of those relationships. The cabinet is doing absolutely nothing to help that. Every week is another story about how Lord Frost is trying to get them to, I mean, it's the equivalent of having signed your lease agreement for your flat and then deciding after 3 months that actually you can't afford the rent and that you want to change it, and it's the landlord's fault that you signed that contract. I mean, it's frankly as simple as that. They were either too stupid to know the effect of the protocol, or they were cheeky as, and this was always their plan, was to keep blaming the European Union, which is, I mean, frankly, it's probably the latter. So I think we've got major issues there. And what's our answer as Lib Dems? Well, we've got some really important conference motions coming this week that start to set the scene for the damage that Brexit is causing. So, you know, supply chains and food prices and all of that. But I think we need to, sooner than later, move to a customs union single market position to cement the fact that we want those closer economic and, frankly, political ties in with Europe, because that is a huge part of how we start to rebuild that clout on the world stage. But the next thing that they can do, and they can do this immediately, is restore 0.7% aid and, you know, replenish those coffers. This pandemic has shown us the interconnectedness of the world. And it's not just the pandemic we need to get over. Climate change, as we've said, is the biggest thing that is facing the planet. It affects generations. And if we can't lead from the front with the G7 presidency, with the COP presidency, in helping others to help us, and that enlightened self-interest argument, then, you know, who can? So I think that was really, really important. But the thing that I think would make us distinctive, you know, I often dream, and I mean, I'll be perfectly honest, my dream job is still education secretary. I'm not sure that's ever going to change. And, you know, there's currently a vacancy, so who knows? No, I'm kidding. I don't think there is yet now. Certainly when this comes out, there won't be. But if I were foreign secretary, you know, what would the Liberal Democrat approach be? And it's very simple. It's pro-human rights and it's pro-trade. It's not this sort of trade-off between the two. It is actually firmly smack down the middle, understanding that there are occasionally tensions between the two, and that's really important to, you know, draw the lines of where those tensions are. But actually, it's quite simple. It's that international rule-based order, pro-trade, pro-human rights.
It's interesting, before I bring David and Tom in to ask that question, because it's interesting because you look at the way China's now doing its kind of macro power, its international power. It is through trade. It is through now, obviously, there is, or I wouldn't compare Liberal Democrats with the Chinese state, particularly, but they have done that. I don't know what you call it. Would you call it soft power? However you do it, but using their economy to say, actually, you know what, we're going to help do this, but you give us the rights to copper mining or whatever. And that's the way they've gone along over the last, probably over the last decade or so. That's the way China's kind of built its influence. So is that what Britain? That's right. Is that what Britain can do? Is that because we're not going to be a military might? We're not going to be a world's miniature policeman.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I mean, to the Chinese example, you've got to give it to them. They had a strategy and they are following through on that strategy. And it's certainly not the approach we would take, because many of those lower middle income countries, particularly in places like Africa, have now essentially been held to ransom for, you know, these enormous infrastructure projects that were paid for by Chinese money. And then they've got to pay back these loans over a long period of time. And so they find themselves in a position where they're sort of indebted. And it's, you know, it's a sort of a Wonga scheme of international influence. And I'm not sure that's the way that we would approach it. I do think the way that aid is given, though, needs rethinking, you know, and there is a movement now in the international development world to stop thinking about it in terms of aid and actually start recognizing, for many of these countries, frankly, it's repatriation of some of these resources that we took from them during the Industrial Revolution and beyond. And, you know, we need to very much be humble in our position, but recognize the wealth that we have came off the backs of very often their people in the form of slaves and others. I think it's really interesting how that is a narrative that is developing in the international development world. That sort of, it's not sort of a patriarchal or altruistic model. It's much more, actually, we owe you this, and it's the very least we can do. But the soft power that we wield as a country cannot be underestimated. The English language alone is worth so much. And yet at the same time, and Wendy Chamberlain had a debate on this the other day, they're undermining the British Council, which is one of the most effective ways of spreading one of our most effective tools in our box. So they are not just dismantling hard power, because they're reducing the amount of money that's going towards troops, and, you know, the real struggles, and Jamie's been brilliant at raising that as defense spokesperson, but they are also fundamentally undermining our soft power too. And that's why I've come to the conclusion that Global Britain is an absolute joke. It's just a slogan, it's completely empty. And actually every action of what they're doing is the exact opposite of what they should do if they were serious about it.
Tom?
No, I just find this absolutely fascinating. And I think this kind of brand of Global Britain is, I completely agree with you, Layla, it's just nothing more than a slogan. But just to think about in terms of kind of the Liberal Democrats ourselves, how do we make more of this? Like, my worry is that, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, get Brexit done. It doesn't, it's easy for people to remember and easy for people to kind of agree with, but it didn't really represent getting Brexit done at all. And my worry is that global Britain kind of resonates with people, even though it's not necessarily true. So how do we make this resonate with people on the doorstep?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two parts to that. I was really struck, and I'm sure, and I know many of you went to Chesham, and many more listening went to Chesham too. And I was really surprised that foreign affairs stuff was coming up on the doors. Really surprised, because let's face it, it doesn't tend to. It's not normal for it to. And what was coming up was the aid cuts. And the reason for that was because it felt really personal, because a lot of the people that I was meeting were members of church groups, gave to various charities, you know, and felt really proud of the way that Britain had always given a helping hand to those most in need. And it's been also really interesting to see how across Parliament there have been Tory backbenchers making the same noises, you know, from as prominent as Theresa May to many backbenchers, many of whom I'd never sort of seen come out and bat for this. The debates were incredible. They were so united across both sides, really, really uncommon for Parliament to do that. And I think we start by pointing out to people that, you know, it's the broken promise, it's the promising too much and then under delivering, and start to poke holes in these great slogans of theirs. But at the same time, having our own positive vision about what we would do differently. And I think for that, it's going to really depend on, you know, that local area and what's going to affect them. So actually, and whilst we, you know, don't want to be banging on about Brexit, we definitely don't. There are definitely fallouts from Brexit right now that are affecting my constituents. Food prices are going up. We can't get hold of flu vaccine because we don't have enough HGV drivers. I noticed at Prime Minister's questions today, he's trying to say, oh, it's a global issue. Well, it is, but we're the worst. And the reason why we've got less resilience to it is because of our immigration policy, and we aren't letting those drivers from Europe and elsewhere who used to prop up the issues that we've got come and fill those gaps. I was talking to farmers during my villages tour that I did before coming back to Parliament, and they were in tears, some of them, because they've had to get rid of crop. Some of them are poultry farmers. They literally don't know how they're going to pluck the turkeys in time for Christmas, because they've got the turkeys, they've been rearing the turkeys, but the next stage is the preparation of the turkey in time and the hanging and all the rest of it so that it's ready for Christmas. And they're worried that they're not going to be able to get the people in. Even if they advertise and they have to push up wages, there just aren't enough people in the UK who want to do those kinds of jobs. So we're going to start seeing it on our table, in our supermarket shelves. And I think we need to show people that there was another way. All of these wounds are completely self-inflicted, and they didn't have to be that way. And there is an alternative, and it is the Liberal Democrats, and we would have done things differently. And that's that positive vision that we can then sell off the back of it.
David.
Yeah, I just really wanted to go back to a question that's been going around since we had the episode prior about Afghanistan, and it was really around the Liberal view of interventionism, or intervention, I should say. And really, to me, it seems as we move ahead and we move with the legacy of what happened post 9/11 and also post the Iraq War, we're really trapped between two distinct ideas of one of very, mega ultra hawk of let's go straight in and deal with problems. And the other one now seems to be, as John said, this increasing isolationism from the West of not wanting to get involved in any conflict and really shying away from it. I guess my question really is when do we get involved in the world, and really what learnings can we take from what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, and really look at what a liberal policy in that area looks like?
Yeah, well, I think there's very much a settled position on this. Intervention for the sake of regime change is not acceptable. And frankly, it's illiberal if we think about it. If that is the political system, as flawed, as deeply flawed as it may be, we have to swallow the pill and live with it. And if they choose that they want a different system, then that's not for us to decide. And it's really tough, but I've lived in countries that have different systems, and by and large, people buy into it. And then there are issues that pop up around the side. But there is an area that I think needs to be in the forefront of all of our minds, and it's part of the international rule-based order. And first of all, is that there are some basic human rights, and there are basic rights that no matter where you are in the world, and they are as basic as the right to life, the right to food, the right to be free from persecution, the right to education, all of that. And particularly when it comes to potential genocides and persecution, I think that is where we need to be strident. And I know that there is a debate, obviously, in the party going on about the Uyghurs. I'm really pleased that there is a Uyghur motion coming to this conference. I was really humbled to receive a certificate of appreciation from the Uyghur people this week. And it says, and I've got it on my desk, it says, "We'll always remember those who stood by them in their hour of need." And I honestly, my heart just broke. But I'm proud to have done that. And Christine got one too. And Alistair, of course, led that charge. And there are some who are saying that, well, we shouldn't have taken a stance quite as strong as that without, it going to the International Criminal Court and it being properly investigated and all the rest of it. My answer to those people is that I have met enough people who have told me stories of their own families for me to say there is something wrong with this. You add to that the now wealth of evidence that's being put together by the Uyghur Tribunal chaired by Jeffrey Nice and others around the world, and it's unequivocal to me that there is something certainly worth investigating. And if there is a suspicion of genocide, I would rather have to say, sorry, I got it wrong after the fact, than not standing up against it now and potentially averting it getting any worse and bringing prominence to it. And you know what, genuinely, if the Chinese government decide to let observers in and it turns out that none of this was true, I will be the first to say I'm sorry. But I just don't think that's ever going to happen. And so while it's the right thing to do, I think it's the right stance to take. So on things like that, I think it's absolutely right that the government does more, and it doesn't. It has not leveled sanctions against, for example, the main member of the Chinese Communist Party who's in charge of that particular genocide. There's no sanctions against them. They're very pussyfooted around it. They don't want to upset them because of trade. Actually, I think we need to be doing a lot more trade. I also think we need to be standing up for those of Asian heritage in the UK that have, through this, but also through coronavirus and the links to Wuhan at the beginning, been subjected to awful hate crimes. There's lots of examples of this, both in Oxford. I was talking to Sarah Olney, a few in Richmond as well. It's just totally unacceptable. And so you can balance having those really strong positions on the international stage with all the sensitivities that go around it.
And I know, sorry, go on, Tom.
I was just gonna ask that. Do you, on this idea of what you were just saying with what's happening in China, do you think that Britain, we're almost in a stage now where we're just almost too cautious with things? And is this a throwback to what happened with the legacy of the Iraq War, for instance? I mean, a few years ago, if we think the vote that happened in Syria, and I think the same when it was voted not to get involved in the Syrian conflict, and I think that same day there was an awful gas attack that happened on the people there, and I remember just thinking, like, we as a country now politically are just hamstrung because it's almost like our politicians don't have the courage, or they don't feel that they're fully protected from any kind of fallout. Why do you think that is? Why are we too cautious?
It's really interesting. I remember that vote. I wasn't an MP at the time, and I remember lobbying our MPs not to support it. And to be perfectly honest, I think I got that wrong. And we've seen the aftermath of it, and it was very clear that human rights abuses and entire peoples were killed by their own government, with the international rogue state actors who were supporting them behind the scenes, and it was the wrong call. Interestingly, when a vote on intervention in Syria did come in the last parliament, we discussed it at length as a political party. We remembered the harm caused by not going in a few years previous, and the argument being made was, would we be in this terrible position now? And we did vote. It was after the fact, and I think I regretted that my intervention on Theresa May that day was, had you told us, we would have supported you. And I think actually, when it comes to human rights, people are much more likely to intervene. I think the problem is, in the aftermath of the Iraq War, was the assumption that people were suspicious of the government, because whilst on the one hand, we were being told we were going in for human rights and security reasons, in reality, it was about regime change, and it was about all sorts of other things. And so the Iraq War poisoned so much. I think when there is clear human rights breaches, it needs to be done ideally multilaterally. And this is, right back to the beginning of our conversation, the impotence of Boris Johnson to be able to exert any kind of influence on other world leaders right now. They see him as an absolute joke. And that is hurting not just us here, because the blowback for terrorism and security that's going to come off the back of the shambles in Afghanistan, I'm sorry to say, is probably the next problem we're going to have to face. But it's hurting them elsewhere as well. So I think now we will be braver. But I think the reasons for doing it need to be very squarely on those human rights ground. And this government is failing because they can't even level economic sanctions, let alone send in the US peacekeeping troops. So UN peacekeeping troops that we'd suggested that they put on the ground in Afghanistan to make sure that human rights abuses weren't being perpetrated.
And I know there's a million topics we could talk about under your brief, Layla, but I know you've got to go. I just want one final point. One of the big changes that's about to happen and doesn't get a lot of attention is actually the stepping down of Angela Merkel in Germany. I know. If you think of leaders of the free world, Angela Merkel over the last 16 years, I think it is, has actually probably been that person, if you thought of who's been that steady influence through the world. What do you think the German elections, Angela stepping down, just very briefly, how does that going to affect Europe and Britain?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. We've also got French elections coming up, of course. And so whenever you've got, two big powers like that, navel gazing as you do on the domestic agenda, then Europe tends to sort of take a back seat in the short term. What I'm hoping for, and I think what's quite interesting, is there's a surgence in green policies across both at the moment, and I think that's really good. Politically, what I hope for is very much a sort of race to the top, and different parties across the world fighting for which country is the greenest. I think is nothing but a good thing. I, on a personal level, should say it's been incredible to have such a prominent female leader of such a powerful country as a female politician, always looking around the piece for brave souls to look up to. And I think that will be sorely, sorely missed. So let's see who ends up replacing them. I will agree, however, it's going to be quite a destabilizing moment, potentially for the European Union. And I think we're just going to have to wait and see. But my stance is going to be, as soon as we're able through our networks, and we're still involved in obviously Liberal International, and we've got good relationships with Aldi and others, we need to be reaching out and making sure that we cement those connections so that we don't lose our influence on the inside.
Layla, thank you so much for your time. You've gone over what you said you would do, so I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. As you can see, we can talk forever about this brief. It's literally as big as the world. So
we treat the podcast as some sort of therapy, so you're more than welcome to come back on. But go enjoy the rest of your day. We'll probably be watching the cabinet reshuffle like you will. But on behalf of the podcast, thank you for everything you do for the party, and it's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast.
Oh, thanks, everybody. It's been lovely to be with you.
All the best, Layla. Thank you.
Cheers, Layla.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Layla.
Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
So that was the interview with Layla Moran. I mean, so much to take away from that. She speaks so well as well. But David, what are your main takeaways from that?
I think really it just confirms the whole reasons why really I've joined the Lib Dems, and mainly from a foreign policy perspective, the commitment to obviously upholding human rights is a major factor, and also really just the way I think Layla looks at the world from a foreign policy perspective. It's considered, it takes into account a lot of where Britain's place globally should be, and also takes into account the other aspects of really where we've come from and just its recent past, and really what's the path back towards us really having an influence on the global stage. And I think a lot of what she said makes huge sense. So yeah, obviously it's a good thing.
And Tom, your thoughts, and then we'll talk a little about your announcement as well, Tom. So obviously, there's been lots of announcements today. But first of all, your reaction on what Layla said?
Oh, I thought Layla was brilliant, but I mean that's no surprise because she is brilliant. I thought we kind of got towards it at the end there about the political kind of caution around foreign affairs and foreign intervention was really fascinating there, and particularly Layla kind of saying, well, I was against the Syrian intervention, but actually I called that wrong, which is remarkable when a politician always says that.
I was thinking at that time, if Benghazi was happening again, what would we do?
Yeah, and exactly,
because
I think just even hearing a politician saying the words, I got it wrong, you just don't hear that. And I think that gives people trust back in people who, we're all human and we can all make mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly right. And I remember that night so well, that vote, and then straight afterwards, it was the announcement about the chemical attack, and then if you think what's happened since then with the growth of ISIS, which was based in Syria, and you just think if we could go back in time, how would people vote differently? And hearing Layla saying, well, actually, I think we got that one wrong there. Actually, we could maybe, if you bring all those people back from Westminster, if we could get in that time machine and go back to then, maybe the world, it wouldn't look massively different, but maybe there would be a key difference in the Middle East if that vote had gone a different way. And I'm fascinated by that.
And just right at the end there, that whole thing about the stabilization of Europe. And it's interesting because we've seen, obviously, the Norwegian elections have just happened as well. And so there's been a kind of a narrative going around that populism is on the rise. But actually, if you look at the rise of social democratic policies in Europe, actually, we would say there's been quite a shift towards that over the last year or two as well, along with more environmental policies coming into it as well. So really interesting what's going to happen in Europe. But no, I mean, final thoughts from you guys before we end this podcast. But we should just say, I did tease it though, that by the time this goes out, Tom will have been confirmed as our target
education secretary.
As education secretary, yeah, that's right. Well, Tom, I've got to say the bar's really low, so you'll be okay. But Tom will be our target candidate in Cheadle, which I think is our number 5 or 4 seat in the UK. So congratulations, Tom. Very well earned.
Congrats, Tom.
Yeah,
thank you.
Let's go get them. But yeah, final thoughts from you, Tom, on what we've heard, and that's it, really.
We need to get Layla into the Foreign Office. That's my final thoughts, is let's win. Let's get her in, and then we can sort out the world. That'd be brilliant.
David?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I agree with Tom. I think we need to get a more considered approach to foreign policy. And right now, with the gentleman who's currently occupying that office, but might not be by the time we've finished this podcast, that's not what we're getting. And we're getting a shambolic outreach. It's not global Britain. It's in fact Little Britain, and maybe Boris Johnson's Matt Lucas and Dominic Raab as David Walliams.
No, because those two are funny, while Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab are painful. But thank you, David. Thank you, Tom. And we should give a huge thank you to Layla once again for coming on the podcast. What have you guys thought of it? What are you guys watching and listening? Comment below. Do you agree with Layla? Do you not agree with Layla? Did you think it was refreshing when she said she got something wrong? So do comment. Also like the podcast as well. Help us beat those algorithm gods that keep on restricting us. But thank you so much for watching. Again, you can follow these guys on social media. I'll link their Twitter accounts in the show notes. You can follow everything to do with the Lib Dem Podcast at LibDem Pod. My name is John Potter. Thank you so much for being here. We'll be back with another episode very soon.